Welcome to APA's ninth Town Hall on COVID-19. My name is Billy Zidek, APA Standards and Codes Administrator. Allow me to review a couple of housekeeping items before we start. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We ask that you utilize the chat box for the Q&A segment of this session. While we attempt to respond to all questions submitted, should we run out of time, responses will be posted to APA's COVID-19 RAQ Recently Asked Questions webpage. We also remind participants to ensure their speaker volume levels are set for your comfort. Our speakers are gathering us from across the continent, and as such, varying volumes will be present. Today's session will award professional continuing education credits and AIA HSW CLUs. For AIA certificates, please email me at Billy, B-I-L-L-I-E, @apa.org, along with your AIA membership number. Our webinar recording will be posted to APA's website later this afternoon. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email within 72 hours providing designated links to all our webinar recordings, presentation slides, as well as information on upcoming webinars and town halls. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Lander Medlin, APA's Executive Vice President, your moderator for today. Lander, take it away.
Welcome all attendees. We appreciate your engagement in these town hall meetings as we further explore the impact of COVID-19 on our facilities organizations and the education enterprise. I'd like to thank both our regular participants and any new folks who decided to join us today. Our prior town halls have been recorded along with answers to all your questions and posted to the APA COVID-19 website resource center. It is constantly being updated, so please return regularly. And our town hall meetings do occur every Friday at this time with a different target and focus. Next week's is called Hint, In the Trenches, Cleaning Protocols, HVAC Requirements, and Other Facilities Necessities. Again, thanks for joining the dialogue. We really want your questions. That's what makes this a rich conversation and the special community we share. So post them at any time. I would also like to extend a big APA thank you to our two business partner sponsors, Jacobs through Nina Woolman and JCI through Russ Garcia, for their generous longtime support of our annual Thought Leaders Symposium as we launch some of its content for this town hall. Now, I said last week, we are staring down the barrel of fall reopening. Now, amidst the uncertainty of testing and tracing capabilities and the relentless nature of this virus transmission capability, yet institutions are slowly starting to weigh in. That's why we chose this topic today, the next in our series on the road to reopening your institution. It's the impact of COVID-19, preparing now for the student of 2024. The three panelists today will drive home the impact on fall enrollment, composition of the student body, faculty reactions, the campus learning environment, and why campus matters. Hence, the road to reopening takes many planning paths. It is one unimaginable nightmare after the next, and the risks, the liabilities for getting this wrong are enormous. So here's the format for today's town hall. I'll provide an introduction to set the context, mention a new survey, set the stage for the changing dynamics of student enrollment, learning, and facilities role in both, introduce our stellar panel who will provide some opening or framing remarks, and then we'll get right to the Q&A, as I know you've got many questions to ask this exceptional panel. I'll conclude with a survey request, call for images, available resources, save the date, and some closing remarks. I've opened each town hall with a compare and contrast of the coronavirus statistics. Oh, the towering death toll. Globally, we recorded 4.4 million cases and surpassed 300,000 deaths. Yet the true number could be far higher. Yesterday, 5/14, the U.S. recorded slightly over 1.4 million cases, more than 85,000 deaths. We're running at a rate of approximately 1,500 deaths per day. Now, some states are creeping out of crippling lockdowns, and others are struggling to get a handle on their outbreaks. With fears of a second wave comes the warning. It's not over until it's over. The virus is in control. Clearly, we need aggressive testing, contact tracing, treatment, and efficacious vaccine. We're nowhere near the end of this pandemic. We definitely have to rethink what normal means. Social physical distancing still remains our most effective tool for deterrent and to reduce the R factor. We must remain vigilant. We cannot become complacent. This will take individual commitment. As I've said before, use your head, stop the spread. Now, the impact on the economy continues to widen and deepen. America's flood of layoffs continued with almost 3 million jobless claims filed this past week, bringing the 2-month tally to 36.5 million people. The hunger crisis worsens. Food prices soared higher than the past 50 years. Food banks face unprecedented demands and approaching capacity. Now we have learned that children are at risk of contracting multi-symptom inflammatory syndrome. There is no business as usual. Higher education is facing a reckoning with so many unknowns. What do we know? This week, the Chronicle of Higher Education cited 70% of higher education institutions are moving to reopen this fall face-to-face. Others, such as the California State University system of 23 campuses and Harvard Medical, announced they will remain fully online through the fall. A student survey reflected 65% desire a face-to-face offering, with 31% only desiring virtual right now. ACE, the American Council on Education, recent survey of college and university presidents found presidents' #1 concern is fall enrollment, and #2, financial viability, and they weighed in heavily on the rising concern of student mental health. Furthermore, 345 colleges and universities have been identified at risk of closure, and fewer high school students have applied for financial aid. That's the lay of the land. So whether your institution chooses to close, stay online, slow transition, hybrid approach, full reopen, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You need to prepare now for how facilities can and will respond. Do we even know what the questions are? Can you provide collaborative support now and through the summer for a successful fall reopening, in whatever form that takes? Hence our panel today, each speaking to the startling degree of uncertainty in this changed world of enrollment, the need to put students first, the necessity for sustained institutional collaboration, and a firm focus on why campus matters. As we will continue to see, the road to reopening takes many planning paths. Let's start first with John Bockenstedt, Vice President, Enrollment Management, Oregon State University. John has been in his current role since July 2019. Previously, he was Associate Vice President at DePaul University for 17 years. John has over 35 years experience in enrollment management and admissions and has worked at a wide range of colleges and universities, from non-selective to highly selective and from very small to very large. He has special interest in data visualization and the appropriate application of corporate strategy to higher education, and is the author of 2 blogs, one on higher education data and one on important trends and topics in admission and enrollment management. John is an Iowa native and holds a BA in English and an MS in marketing and management. John will reflect on the virus unknowns, the various economic indicators that have been used as predictive enrollment tools in the past, price elasticity, parents and students' trepidations regarding COVID-19 for the fall semester, and the guessing game it presents. John?
Good morning, everybody, or good morning from Oregon. Good afternoon to many of you on the East Coast, and I guess creeping up in the Central Time Zone. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to have a few minutes of your time to talk about this from an enrollment management perspective. As Lander mentioned, I've been in this profession over 35 years, but the profession of enrollment management is not much older than that, actually, about 50 years, give or take. And I can say without any fear of contradiction that this will be our most interesting year in history, interesting in both a good and a bad way. And before I start, I want to cut to the chase. I have absolutely no answers and can't give you any certainty about what the fall will hold. And anybody in enrollment management or any other profession who tells you that they can is either kidding you or kidding themselves. Just this morning, I had a conversation with a colleague who said she was talking with her president. And the president made the comment that we can't control coronavirus, but at least we can control enrollment. I wish we were on a webcam now so I could see all your faces reacting to that comment, because I think that's just one of the funniest things I've ever heard a president or anybody say about coronavirus and its effect on enrollment. The fact is, it's just wrong. Frequently, we in our profession pride ourselves that enrollment management is pretty esoteric, and it's frankly kind of hard for outsiders to understand. We talk about student behavior and parent behavior and price elasticity and market position in ways that are not always something people in the academy understand or like to think about, but we really have to have one foot looking inside the university and one foot looking outside. And it's an interesting straddle job that we have to do on a daily basis. But even in the best years, if we didn't have COVID-19 and we were sitting here in May, we have a lot of things that we need to worry about that we can't predict. So for instance, the economy. We know, and I've seen recently, it can turn bad or it can heat up really quickly. And that has a big effect, of course, on college enrollment. In college enrollment, if you're like most institutions in the country, has a big effect on your viability and your financial outcomes for the year. We have no idea what competitors are doing. We can kind of get a sense of it, but if 20% of your applicants apply to the other institution in your city or in your state, or that looks like you, how the way in which they respond to a good or a bad year can have ripple effects, not just to you, but to other institutions in your competitive market set. I like to remind people that we in enrollment management are largely dependent on the whims of 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds and their parents. And anybody who has a teenager at home can probably tell you those are not easy things to predict, even on the best days. And then there are things like how well your majors fit to the current job trends. So for instance, what about liberal arts? Are people still worried that English majors won't be able to get jobs? Or what about nursing, which has always been, in my experience, one of the most cyclical majors you can imagine. It heats up, it cools down, and if you're a school with a big nursing major, that can have dramatic effects on how your enrollment looks in the fall. And clearly, of course, this is anything but a best year. And so we have a lot of factors coming in to play that we've never anticipated and have no comfort with. So one of the things we like to do is, as we're thinking about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the fall, is take a look back at history. And we wonder, does history give us any clues as to what the fall might look like? And the answer, of course, is yes. You can always extract something from what's happened before, but actually no, because this is so different. In 2007 and 2008, a lot of people in my profession thought everything was going south with the explosion and the breaking of the housing bubble, the collapse of markets, the drop in the stock market. It was really hard to tell what was going to happen, but it actually turned out pretty well for many institutions. That is, if you count head count. But EM, enrollment management, is now much more about how much, that is, how much revenue you generate, than how many heads show up. You can have a great year in enrollment and have a really bad year from a revenue standpoint, and vice versa. And that's an important thing and a hard thing for people, especially in facilities who count bodies, to sort of get their head around. That 2007, 2008 cycle started a downward spiral on average net revenue, or at least didn't keep up with previous years gains in net revenue. And that, of course, trickles down to everybody, especially people who work and manage with facilities and buildings on campus. It resulted in a lot of deferred maintenance and the escalation of that as margins shrunk and we were generating less revenue for each student. But in retrospect, I think people sort of believed that the economic problems we were experiencing were deep but temporary, and that it was still a good idea to invest in higher education for the future. Now, however, this challenge that we face is potentially fatal to both parents and to students. It's having enormous economic effects, of course, with a 40% unemployment among service workers and lowest paid workers, and 6 to 8% for the highest paid workers. And I'd remind everybody that that's where all the competition for students is anyway, and it's going to heat up and it's going to get worse. So if history doesn't help, what about surveys? There are a lot of surveys out there from a lot of companies. The most dire predictions say that 1 out of 6 students will not go to college in the fall. I personally find that really, really hard to believe. And one I just saw this morning from Carnegie Dartmouth that says 2% will delay their enrollment and 42% won't delay no matter what happens. Interesting. I suspect the truth lies somewhere between those two extremes. And of course, someone who produced a survey somewhere is going to be very close to being 100% right, but no one knows who that person is, and no one knows if that's just luck or it's really skillful analysis. So before you rely on any survey to think about what's happening in the fall, ask yourself how certain your campus plans are for fall. And that should give you a good clue. If you're like a lot of places, you're planning on dozens of contingencies, none of which you're certain are likely to happen or will happen or even could happen. And then take that uncertainty and imagine that you're the parent of an 18-year-old, or you're an 18-year-old yourself. How willing are you to travel 500 miles only to be told you may have to pack up and go back home in October? How willing are you to pay for a commodity of Zoom U, even if it's a place like Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford, excuse me, when a community college will effectively be the same thing, 50 students sitting in a Zoom classroom listening to an instructor? How certain are you that your job will even be there in October when the bills first come due? What does your college savings account look like in September when you start to face those bills on campus? How many mortgage payments have you already missed? And what's happened to grandma's IRA? We know that grandparents are a big supplier of cash for students who are looking at paying for and enrolling in college. And then you think about the connection, finally, between EM people and campus people. At Oregon State right now, we're dealing with the possibility that students may have to sit 6 feet apart, or that faculty members may not want to be in a classroom with students who could be carrying but not symptomatic. We are dealing with the real possibility that the governor might mandate that all residence hall facilities be single occupancy. And if that's the case, our residence hall capacity has just been cut in half, and we're a campus that's highly residential. You've already thought about dining halls and science labs and research facilities if your university does that. I would say the thing that has been the guiding factor to us as we go forward is to try to put students first. We watched with interest as campuses across the country refused to refund student fees, gave students a week or less to pack up their belongings and move home, even though some of them literally could not get home, and literally some of them did not have a home to go to. So this is a really good time to think about all those archaic policies, procedures, processes that you have on campus, and see if it's at all possible for you to streamline them, put students first, and make your institution better for it. So I'll be back at the end, I guess, to answer enrollment questions, but do know that the good thing here, if there is a good thing, is that this is symptomatic and systematic. It's nothing that any of us are going through individually, and we're all in this together, and I wish you the best of luck. Lander?
Thank you so much, John. That was really terrific. You gave us even a better lay of the land about what is actually happening with the numbers, that history isn't helping us in that regard, the competition being stiff, the surveys, we need to question where those surveys are coming from, the basis of that data, really putting students first, and you outlined some of the things that happened that may have not done that and set that right impression. And I really loved at the end when you talked about thinking about and you captured it in the word archaic, tradition, all of those policies and procedures that we could actually seriously consider streamlining, throwing out, and really paying attention to that, because this gives us a real opportunity if we put ourselves into the students, with the students' perspective. That was terrific. Thank you, John. And we will have questions for you as they're already coming in, so that's great. So now I'm going to move to our second panelist, which is Keith Woodward. He's Associate Vice President of Facilities Operations at Quinnipiac University. Keith manages the day-to-day operations of 190 employees, over 3.1 million square feet, and 750 acres of property on 3 campuses in 2 towns. Keith's responsibilities include creating a culture of facilities success and making sure the operations staff understand the importance of delivering on a positive student and community experience when on campus. In addition, Keith co-chairs the University Emergency Management Team and previously served on the University Center for Excellence Board for over a decade. Keith is the chair of APA's Thought Leader Symposium and Series, and on the faculty of APA-U's Institute Facility Management. Keith will discuss the composition and makeup of these digital native students, their seeming desire for face-to-face versus online delivery, the criticality of enterprise-wide collaboration, and Connecticut's thinking and approach to date. Keith?
Thank you, Lander. And thank you, Lander, for doing these town halls. I think every one of them has been informative if we've had a chance to watch them. So thank you to you, Suzanne, Billy, and all the others in the APA community. I think it's great. I did want to just take a moment and thank our president, Judy Olean, and my boss, Sal Filardi, for supporting APA and our participation. We find great value in APA, and these webinars are just another example of that. So just listening to the town halls of the previous, I know there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible so we can get to those questions, because I think those are the most beneficial to the listener. So as Lander mentioned, I do chair the Thought Leader Series. In addition to some of the other things she mentioned, I am chair of the task force for COVID-19 for our university, primarily probably because of my emergency management hat, I would guess. We have about 12 members on the team. We meet daily, in some cases twice a day, with conference calls on weekends. So it's COVID-19 all the time. We're very fortunate. We have an infectious diseases doctor on our committee to our medical school. So that has been very helpful. And I would encourage anybody, if you have access to somebody that can help on that front, that they provide a unique perspective to everything in the world we're presently in. Our situation is our students went away on spring break and they never came back. So they were on spring break. We closed the institution literally 2 months ago today. And that means that there was a lot of students here who had their stuff literally in place the way they left it on spring break the week before the 15th. So our institution made a decision to try and help first responders and provide them some space. So we boxed up about 2,000 students, which was about 23,000 boxes and about 43,000 labels, and more tape guns and rolls of tape than you can imagine, combined with some bubble wrap. I have 180 or 90 folks that boxed them all up in 10 days. They come back to get their stuff a week from today in a very segmented, intentional, about 200 people per day to come back and get their stuff. So then we can begin the process of getting ready for the fall. And hopefully we'll be on ground, and I'll get to that in just a second. We've essentially closed our campus to visitors. I think our president's done a particularly great job communicating to our community with town halls and messaging. I'm sure that is very similar for all of you. And as Lander referenced, the state of Connecticut has a reopening plan for higher education. There was a task force through the governor's office that put together a plan. I am going to try and link that in the chat if I get a chance to do that today. If not, Suzanne or Lander will get a copy of that. And it's really a very nicely done piece, which provides a roadmap. And there are essentially 3 or 4 different factors, and it's not all, blue skies and sunshine and green grass, but because there are some challenges in there. However, from our lens here in Connecticut, we need to put together a plan for monitoring the health conditions to detect infection, and I'll get to that in a second. We have a plan for containment to spread the virus of the disease when detected, to contain it. And then if necessary, we need to provide a shutdown plan in the event that that becomes necessary. So there are challenges within those. And Lander touched on them a little bit in terms of, testing is a significant, it's not hard to test, but getting the tests is the hard part. And right now, just the availability of testing. So our committee is working on that as well. Contact tracing is also an issue. And John touched on a couple of things himself, ratios of bathrooms to students, occupancies of residence halls, classroom layouts. I mean, 2 days ago, I was in 3 or 4 or 5 of our different classrooms with different styles, trying to figure out how many people could be in them, just based on what we had in the rooms. So those are all challenges. Our task force actually has kind of broken into 9 different segments of our university, everything from what health and safety protocols will be. Our academics are obviously critical, our physical space, which I just referenced with classrooms. What is the student experience going to look like in the fall, and how is it going to differ, and what can we do to make sure that it doesn't differ from the level of service that we're currently providing for our students? Signage is obviously a significant one. Return to work. We have folks that have literally not been out of their house in 2 months, and trying to have them come back to campus. And do they need to come back to campus? What's our work from home policy going to look like? So all of those things are challenging, as well as some other things like managing the expectations of cleaning. And I believe next week's town hall is going to get into that, so I won't get it too deep into that. But the expectation is if it is today that facilities person or custodian is going to be right behind them as they enter the bathroom, that's just not realistic. And so people need to understand that. And so our cleaning schedules may vary a little bit, but there's not going to be somebody just standing there cleaning bathrooms and door handles all day long. We will do it when necessary, but it just can't be a full-time job. So people have to understand that. I think the other thing we're working on is making sure we have the appropriate PPE here on campus. I think a lot of people probably have been doing that as well, but not just thinking about the summertime, but thinking about the fall and thinking about what people will require. We have made the decision that we are going to provide every single person at least 1 mask that is washable. So it will be something that will be a requirement here on campus if that standard is still in place, and the university is going to purchase that. Early this morning, I authorized a boatload of hand sanitizer be purchased, as well as wipes and disinfectants and the whole 9 yards. I'm sure many of you are doing those same things, and I know it's challenging to get a hold of it, but I think it's also important. And then lastly, or before I get to the student perspective and the thought leaders for a second, John mentioned it a little bit. Sharing the information is so critical, and sharing the communication is so vitally important. I know at our institution, we don't have a lot of public roadways. We have private roadways, and we were finding that some of the institutions were offering tours on public roadways. And so even though you can't get out of the car, parents are still As John mentioned, 17 and 18-year-olds are still with parents looking to trying to make decisions. So one of the things I said to our enrollment manager was, hey, look, just so you know, if you want to drive in the quad, which would normally be absolutely unheard of, our quad is designed to have a fire truck in the quad. And so making that information available to enrollment management folks so we can provide an opportunity for people to get into spaces that they might not normally see from the road was a huge part of us doing kind of drive-by tours. I mean, our drive-by tours are, car A and car B. Car A has an admission person, car B has the family. And nobody gets out of the car, nobody gets into a building, but you get a sense of place and you get a sense of campus. And I would also echo what John said in terms of the student surveys that I've read, specifically from our student government association, they want to be back. And if you can almost, it's palatable. You can taste it in what they write and how desperately they want to be back on campus. And that's a student group that is technologically advanced. That is a student group that has grown up with a phone pretty much in their hand their entire lives. And so from that perspective, when we talk about the thought leaders and we talk about the 2024 student, we're trying to meet the needs of the 2024 enrolled student today and thinking about how we can get there. So when the thought leaders monograph comes out later this year, you're going to see a lot of those things in the monograph. What is the relationship with facilities with our ability to serve students, and how do facilities folks collaborate, be more collaborative, break some of those things that we've done in the past and really understand the student experience. So you'll see a lot of that stuff. I don't want to get too deep into the thought leaders, but there are a lot of different things that you're going to be able to pull, I think, from this monograph that I think will be helpful going forward. So I think that's it, Lander.
That's terrific. Keith, really wonderful comments about, the struggle you're having, just like everyone at the moment, with getting tests, contact tracing. I particularly like the fact that you have medical person, not remembering exactly the type of person, but that connection and that capability on your task force, on anyone that can get that capability, it really does help. You talked a lot about the kinds of challenges that everyone is facing, and I think it's important that you weighed in on those. And I love the fact that you were talking about the students' desire for a rich campus experience. And how can we capitalize on that with students now, even if we can't bring them back, if that's what happens. And ultimately, then the relationship between enrollment managers and the rest of the team on campus with respect to students and facilities, breaking down those barriers, doing what John also talked about, the archaic policies and procedures and the archaic ways in which we put barriers up to that engagement so that we understand the true student experience and how we can all contribute to it. So really, really terrific, Keith. I thank you so much for that. So now I'm going to move to our final panelist, which is Michael Hagan. Michael's a visiting scholar, Center for 21st Century Universities, Georgia Institute of Technology. Michael has worked on the facilities challenges of colleges and universities as a university architect and in private practice. Most recently, he has taught at the University of Kansas, NC State, University of Minnesota, and Georgia Tech. Since 2013, he has been a visiting scholar in the Center for 21st Century Universities at Georgia Tech, researching the value of the physical campus in a digital world. His writing and video interviews with thought leaders are hosted at campusmatters.net. It's a good read. And Michael was a former faculty member for our FAU's Institute Facility Management. Michael plans to focus our attention and that of our institutions on capacity for a student body, the need to appropriately right-size space, student choices, faculty's needs and perspectives, learning spaces and modalities, and the absolute necessity for facilities integration in the decision-making mix. Michael?
Well, thanks, Lander. You've asked me to cover a lot of things there. And I appreciate that, and always the opportunity to talk with folks who are trying to make campuses work. On the next slide, you'll see my most recent post. Let's see, the one before that, maybe. Okay, stick with that. On my most recent, in my most post on Campus Matters, I wrote about the challenges each of you face in rebooting your campuses, particularly since, as John pointed out, you have no idea how many faculty will be coming to campus or how many students. And my central recommendation from that work was the importance of managing both space and time. And so how to get there is I want to share with you this diagram that shows what's been happening in the classroom as the digital world and the physical world of on-campus instruction have been converging over the last 20 years or so, with an acceleration fairly dramatic within the last few months. If we take a look at this diagram, we've got the type of instruction in the horizontal axis, from transmission to practice and application. And then on the vertical axis, we have whether that instruction is being provided by the instructor or by technology. In the upper right-hand corner would be an example of the traditional lecture. And in the upper left-hand corner would be an example of, let's say, art class, some laboratory assignments, those kinds of smaller group activities where there's the instructors directly engaged with the students. But let's go to the next slide. Well, what's happened in the last few months, of course, is that everything has shifted to that lower left-hand corner. That is where instruction has been delivered and transmitted via technology. And the next slide shows the migration that's taken place over time as those classroom environments, traditional classroom environments, the activities there have moved into the domain, more of a digital domain. Particularly the center area that's shown in this diagram, which is a blended setting, whether that's called flipped classrooms or varieties of terms of art that are used for that. But students are very familiar, as are faculty members, perhaps newer faculty members rather than older faculty members, but everybody has been experiencing this experiment in real time in the last couple of months. Faculty and others engaged in the academic enterprise. As shown on the next slide, it becomes clear to me that not all of those classrooms, not all of those classes are going to return. In other words, the larger classes will probably stay online. There'll be functional reasons for that, practical reasons for that. And in fact, it may be that being online, those instructors will have adapted techniques and adopted techniques to make those lectures better by being able to share more information in a more intentionality in the way of their the way they teach. Now, I've been writing about facilities of campus as the digital and physical intersect for some time, and I start with the need to identify some caveats. The first is we all understand that each institution is unique by its own history and location. And we understand certainly that impacts are not going to be uniform across the board. And then there are time limitations in terms of response. In other words, some institutions can move more quickly than others. And finally, there's an issue that we all understand who have worked on campuses of the cultural limitations of response. That it's not just the ability or the inability to do something, it's the willingness of the folks that we work with to do that. The next slide shows 6 recommendations that I have consistently made for institutions to think about their long-term needs and interests. I believe all of these are still valid, but I want to focus on just one of them, and that is the question of managing space and time and rethinking capacity. You just heard Keith mention his experience in the last few days of looking at classrooms, trying to figure out how many people could go into those classrooms. That's a perfect example of the kind of rethinking of capacity that is necessary. There's one other thing that's in there in terms of managing space and time, and that is recognizing that the management of space is often siloed in our institutions. Registrar has responsibility, departments have responsibility for some spaces. And the net effect across the institution is that there's unused space always. I get some pushback when I say it that way, but you can always find that there's more space available because some of it has been restricted from use. So specifics of rethinking the campus and rethinking that capacity are going to be different for every institution. And as you very well know, none of this will be very easy. The next slide is my way of beginning to capture, at least in a single image, the importance of fundamentally what we're talking about. Regardless of the setting, after we strip away all those layers of tradition and place, there's one irreducible condition. That is, the campus is where students, that student on her way to class, and scholars share time and place when ideas are at stake. Without this condition, the institutions would not have existed in the first place. And without this condition, there is no need for the physical campus, and certainly not the ones that we have at this point. I know I've thrown a lot of dust in the air that I hope will generate some good conversation. So Lander, it's back to you.
Thank you, Michael. That was terrific. I'm really struck by the how you went into and through not only the criticality of the culture, but managing space and time. We are all having to rethink capacity with respect to physical distancing and the reconfigurations, and that's going to impact space and time. Particularly important was this issue of siloing of management of space. That has had it's been a long term issue, and it negatively impacts space utilization, as you mentioned. And the notion of a shared experience where shared ideas occur at a shared time and space, hence campus matters, and it is very important. So thank you, Michael, because you're really giving us a lot of things to consider here and to think about. We have a number of questions that are coming in, and they're really very good. I just got one that I think I will actually start with, and I'll go to you, Michael, since you just came off of that, is what technologies are being used for handwritten testing, such as like math problems and chemistry formulas and the need to show your work while online. Do you have a sense of that and what's happening there in terms of the learning side?
in terms of the specific technologies, I don't know exactly which software packages, but what I can say generally is that everybody is scrambling to be able to do that. Some institutions, we'll call them the MITs, have been very active in this area. I'd also toss Arizona State University into that category, where they've been doing these kinds of testings and programs over many years. And so everybody's scrambling to be able to do that. The difficulty, of course, is for institutions for whom this is new territory. It's difficult to get up to speed.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I'm going to go to a series of other questions. Someone had asked, positing a simplistic solution, and they said a new normal where we have a need for more square footage per student. Could we balance that by the ways in which we engage in online delivery? Is there any way to balance that? Michael, I'll tap you, but I also want to go to Keith and John about this. It is an interesting notion, and I think some institutions may be thinking that way. What are your thoughts about that? Again, a simplistic conclusion that maybe we're balancing the need for more square footage for each student for a classroom, but we're balancing it by online delivery. Thoughts?
Yes, and I will toss it to John and Keith in just a moment. That's at the essence, or that is at the center of the question of managing space and time, because what many people are beginning to work with is the idea of different cohorts of students coming to the classroom on different days. And they once upon a time would have come all at one time, whether they're resident or commuting. That introduces some other variables. And so from that standpoint, it's possible to think about a large fraction of the coursework being online and a small fraction of it being in smaller groups, face-to-face. And I think the learning science supports through blended and hybrid courses, the learning science supports that as a better way of instruction than the simple lecture and test methods. But John, I'm sure you've got you're closer to the ground on that question than I am. So.
John?
Yeah, Oregon State has a really well-developed and one of the top-ranked eCampus programs in the country. And so people thought we were extremely well qualified to move into Zoom U, but our eCampus is a completely different platform that requires a lot of instructional designers for every class. So we moved students to Zoom U, unfortunately. We had no other alternative. But the good thing about our experience is that the vast majority of our students on campus have taken a class online via eCampus already. And so they're fairly proficient in that. And there have been interesting discussions on class as to whether we could rotate students through. So for instance, a class of 50 students might have 3 sections of 17 that meet once a week, and then the rest of the classrooms are online via eCampus or via Zoom U in one way, shape, or form. I think it's interesting, but I don't think it generates a lot of space for you. And in fact, I think it's going to add cost and add management cost, if nothing else, to manage the classrooms, to make sure you're using them optimally, to convert classes to 8 p.m. in the evening in order to handle all the tripling of course sections that you might need to offer. So it's a really interesting math, and facilities and classroom management are not my area of expertise, but I think it does hold some promise for us going forward.
Excellent. Keith, you want to weigh in on that one? You can pass if you want, but I have more questions, but maybe you'd like to weigh in on that.
I guess I would just add that similar to what John just referenced, and Michael, we're doing the similar things in terms of trying to manage the classroom with reduced capacity. And I would also add lecture capture might be a way to think about learning in this current environment. And is there an appetite for that later on once we get past this? But to John's reference earlier, there is a cost to that. There is a cost to lecture capture, and what does that look like? And what does that look like from a faculty perspective as well, to participate in that as well? So.
Okay, excellent, Keith. Thank you. And Keith, I'm going to come to you with this one. Others may want to chime in, but the question is around whether you're considering performing major life cycle renovation projects for some older existing buildings and doing as one-way corridors, separate entrances, significant modifications of seating layout, the healthcare grade versus standard commercial grade HVAC. Now, I know we're going to get into some of that next time. However, Keith, you may have some experience right now in terms of what's happening and the way you're thinking about modifications now and how they're impacting longer term decisions. Some thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts on that. One, I took a tour Tuesday of this week with our branding folks, our marketing and communication folks, in terms of signage around all of that. In particular, as we look at one-way ins and outs of buildings, keep in mind fire codes. I would advise you of that first. Second of all, the realities of trying to do that, and specifically when you get a little deeper into the weeds of that, lounge furniture that may be perfectly fine there now, but may not be fine if you're thinking about doing one-way, northbound and southbound, if you will, for sake of conversation. That becomes problematic as much as it does in the classrooms in terms of taking out space, in terms of taking out chairs. I mean, I said to our staff yesterday, I said, we don't have the capacity nor the storage space to take out these spaces. So we have to think differently and creatively about how we can leave that in there, the chairs and desks and tables in there, but yet persuade students from not going in them. Now, whether it's putting all the tablets in a corner in the room, which doesn't seem like a great learning environment, quite frankly, to me, or whether that means just putting signage on them or putting tape over seats that you can't sit in or something along those lines. But yeah, all of those things are things that we're in the process of trying to figure out how we can do if we have to meet the ratio of 6 feet. I mean, I was literally standing in a room with a tape measure 6 feet and measuring them out with a colleague of mine. The other thing that I think is important to get an answer to, and we don't have an answer to this, and as you mentioned, we do, and I mentioned earlier, we have an infectious disease doctor on our staff, is social distancing 6 feet with a mask, or is it 6 feet without a mask? Or if I am wearing a mask for 40 minutes or 50 minutes in a classroom, can I sit next to somebody and just listen? So I don't know the answer to that question. I've asked it several times, but I'm trying to get some answer to that because that might also provide some information, because I don't know about you, everybody on the line, but there are times when you're standing at the grocery store or you're standing in other locations. I'll grant you it's not for 40 or 50 minutes, but by the same token, you're passing people all the time. And so what's the appetite for sitting in a classroom in terms of close distances? So I guess I would answer it that way, and all of those things that we are looking at as well.
That's terrific. I think that, I think that's good. Okay. Let's go to John. I want to ask you this question, and it's around the increased competition that you mentioned for students. and they were talking about not just that competition and the lowering revenue, but how the no SATs, no GPAs, there are a number of things that are potentially calling into question academic standards that we would have normally required for admissions. Can you talk about that from Oregon and maybe what you're hearing from colleagues across different types of schools?
Sure. I think that's really two questions. First of all, most people in my profession don't consider the SAT an academic standard. If you had nothing but the SAT, you could make kind of reasonably good estimates or about a student's college readiness. But once you have all the other things in the file, they really don't predict much anything of value. Uniquely, they explain about 2% of variance in freshman grades and nothing beyond that. And that's been shown in dozens of research studies that aren't sponsored by College Board and ACT. So those are not necessary, and the movement toward test optional this spring is really partly driven by COVID, but there was already a sort of tipping point that we were reaching with places like the University of Chicago and now William & Mary, which has announced its policy, which has been under consideration for at least a year. The second part of that is more troubling and more problematic, however, and that's the complete disintegration of the grading system for the second term of the junior year and maybe sometime into the senior year. And students are largely victims of circumstance there. Some, I think the Seattle public schools have decided to give everybody in every class an A. Other school districts have decided to move everything to a pass-fail basis, and so we suspect everybody will largely pass. And then some school districts have given students the option of choosing a traditional letter grade or a pass-fail, and we don't know and might not know whether what a student chose, especially if we only get a few applications from a school. So it's going to be enormously hard to predict who's going to be admitted and how colleges and universities are going to react. It's just something we've told students and parents. We're going to do our best, and we're going to make the most reasonable and fair decision we can possibly make. Fortunately, the majority of colleges and universities in the country accept the vast majority of applicants already, and fortunately, it's really hard to predict human behavior in an admissions process. The best models that we have explain maybe 30 or 35% of the variance in freshman grades. And so in some sense, admissions is already kind of a crapshoot. I hate to say that and scare people, but it's hard to predict who's going to do extremely well and who's not in your university. So every university is going to deal with this differently. We're still working out the details about how that's going to happen. Once we sort of compile and look at how the school districts are responding to it. But again, it's one of those things, this is unprecedented. It's not anything we ever thought we'd have to deal with on a large scale. And we're sort of learning it as we're doing it. I wish I had a better answer and could give people some more assurance that things are going to be okay. In fact, it's going to be the wild, wild west of college admissions going forward.
It truly is, John. I get that. And I think the enrollment managers and I have colleagues in the associations and you as well are doing a wonderful job, and you're really trying to openly educate everyone. I think your point from your original, when you made your opening remarks about keying in on thinking about whatever archaic policies and procedures that existed that maybe they do or don't inform, and maybe they were just window dressing. And I think you're really getting at that, and I applaud the folks for what they're doing. Michael, I want to go to you on this. Yes, go ahead, John.
If I can add anything to that,
yes.
If there's anything that good that comes out of this, it will be that the numbers that colleges and universities report to things like iPads and the rating agencies will probably be close to nonsensical for the next year. And if it takes some pressure off of including the super selective places to not worry so much about 10 points on the SAT, or if it allows colleges and universities not to worry about a student who's in the top 11% as opposed to the top 10%, it actually could be a good thing for students. Not a good trade-off, but a good single factor in the process that might make things better for everybody. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's perfect. I think that's really an excellent point. And that would be, you know, I'm always looking for silver linings and these things, and that may be one of the silver linings. So that's great. Michael, I'm going to go to you on a very different question, and this has to do with the faculty. You know, we've been talking about the students and the staff side and facilities, et cetera. But we're getting some questions about the methods that institutions are using to have faculty feel safe coming back, how they're approaching, and then the second part of this is how they're approaching faculty to teach multiple classrooms of the same course, because that may lay itself out. So Michael, I come to you, then Keith, and back to John on this question, because I think it's important to have the faculty perspective weighed in on here. Michael?
That's a difficult question, so I appreciate that. Let's see, the first thing is, what are institutions doing in order to make faculty comfortable in coming back? I think the issue here is very similar to that of the student. It's a matter of choice. The reality is that some faculty members, regardless of the precautions, will not choose to come back to campus, and some will. And regardless of the extent of the testing protocols and the follow-up protocols that some institutions have listed, certain faculty members will choose not to, and will continue to teach remotely if they're allowed to do that. And there you get into questions of governance and that sort of thing. The second part of that question deals with the scheduling dilemmas, and that has to do with more sections of a particular course require more time on the part of the instructor. And the solutions that I've found to those who are trying to do that hybridization is to add the number of teaching assistants to that course, and also be able to recognize the importance of the difference between asynchronous and synchronous in terms of managing the time of the instructor. Because the synchronous event, the classroom, the course that we're used to seeing, requires a great deal of time at that particular moment, as does any kind of synchronous messaging or engagement process in the class, a discussion. But if as much of that as possible is moved into an asynchronous mode, and these kinds of technologies and options are typically available in all of the standard learning management systems that institutions have, that can potentially decrease the load on the individual faculty members. At the same time, I must say that I'm beginning to pick up a sense of the level of exhaustion, quite frankly, that faculty members have in what's occurred over the last couple of months. And I'm sure the same thing is true of everybody who's been trying to manage a campus and keep it going. So Keith or John?
Michael, I'd agree with everything you said, and let me just go back to something I previously said just a minute ago. I want to make sure I'm not leaving the impression with the community that's listening that we're trying to cram students into spaces. That's not what we're trying to do. But I do want to try and make sure that we're trying to get the student. Everybody is trying to have an on-ground experience, and so from a classroom perspective, to be as safe as we possibly can. So I felt like there might have been some, and perhaps I was unclear in that last comment that I made. So I just wanted to make sure that I corrected that and kept consistent with what we are doing here. But I would agree exactly with what you said in terms of people returning to campus. We have a whole workplace return group that's working on students, faculty and staff coming back and how they feel comfortable and what can be done, what can we continue to do when we distance, when we work from home. But others, there's a bunch of people who are clamoring to get back here because they feel like a sense of place very similar to the students. But I would agree with almost everything that you said, Michael. There are some specifically in our older age group category that have concerns.
And I would just add, the faculty ramifications are probably a lot deeper than a lot of us may be thinking. Right now, we're in the process in that time of the year when we would typically be renewing adjunct faculty and contingent faculty contracts. And we don't know whether we should be doing that because, of course, we don't know what enrollment is going to be, because we don't know what our instructional modality is going to be, because we don't know the path of the virus. And at the same time, the state of Oregon has told us to expect a pretty massive cut in the state appropriation, which may mean that tenured and full and associate professors may have to increase their teaching load to make the budget balance in the fall. And so to the extent that that affects how people in facilities do things with office space and space that you might have otherwise had to plan for with contingent faculty, it might be an interesting fall in that regard, just in and of itself too.
That's really a great point. And I think you did a beautiful job of articulating the complexities and how they roll themselves back and then move forward as a set of dominoes in terms of what is happening. And John, it does beg a follow-on from someone that says, will college formally reduce enrollment targets in consideration of lessened occupancies and capacities in classrooms? You touched on that in your opening remarks, but this seems like a perfect follow-on to what we were just talking about between faculty and students and physical distancing configurations. Do you want to comment on that?
I suppose it's possible for places that are highly driven by endowment income, for instance, to say we can take a short-term hit on capacity. But of course, new students are typically, depending on the institution, a quarter of your total enrollment. So, and you assume that retention numbers will change, but you don't know how much. So your overall campus facilities won't be more or less constrained, probably, even if you do cut back on a freshman class. But of course, anyone who works at a tuition-dependent institution knows that against all the other things that are happening, cutting back on a freshman class or a new transfer class would be one of the last things any institution wants to do. Most places are eager to grow enrollment because of the cost efficiencies that you get. And so might it happen intentionally? I'd be skeptical about that. Might it happen as a function of all the other things that are happening and you end up with a smaller new student class? Yes. But again, until we have some clarity about what the fall is going to look like, I'm not sure anybody is planning to have smaller enrollment numbers, or anybody's hoping to have smaller enrollment numbers. Some may be planning for it. For instance, our worst case scenario shows us with 0 new international students arriving at the university this fall. And I think that's probably pretty typical for the course. I know Purdue, for instance, is not even issuing I-20s for fall enrollment anymore. So they won't have any new international students, and the ripple effect for that will be felt for a long time, obviously.
Yeah, that's a great point. We had not touched on the internationals, and that is critical element for many campuses, and they're having to plan around that. So really good point. Yes, Michael?
I'd like to add one point to that, to John's observation about international students, and that is that they're heavily skewed towards graduate students, and so that's an important consideration. And across the country, on almost every campus, there are a number of students who could not get home because they're still there. I've heard numbers like 5,000 at some major institutions of international students. So, while that's not an overwhelming issue for everybody, it's certainly something that needs to be taken into account when thinking about what the complement of students for the fall will be.
Good points. Thank you, Michael. That's excellent. And it then takes me to this about the number of hours that a student spends in the classroom, which the person said, given that the student spends about 15 hours per week in the classroom, how are we adapting and or leveraging the rest of the campus for what we would call informal learning spaces, or the campus as a lab, the opportunities for curricular integration and ways in which we may be able to utilize the campus that way. Keith, do you want to take a stab at that one? It's a very interesting question in terms of where it might take us. What do you think?
That is a great question. I haven't really given that as much thought as as you read
the person
that.
Who asked it.
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't think this will specifically answer it, but we are looking at different, maybe transitioning some of our space that was perhaps a conference room that maybe won't be used for a conference room I don't want to say anymore, but for the short term. And could that be used for different things? As an example, food services might be different in the future, or for next semester. So the concept of grab and go, as opposed to standing on a salad bar line, which all the salad bars are closed. So I know the question is around education, and so I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that around education. Maybe perhaps Michael might have some thoughts on that. But we are thinking about our spaces that are collaborative spaces in the past, thinking about maybe turning them into something different for the fall.
Excellent. Michael, do you want to weigh in on that?
Thanks. Well, let's think of the library for the moment. Over the last 20 years, books have left the library, and informal meeting spaces have come into the libraries. And we can see this happening really across the country. At the same time, coffee has come into the library, and 20 years ago that would have been unheard of, to allow food service of any kind in a library. So the libraries are that typically central place on campus that is available for that kind of informal use that I believe the question is directed towards. And there's certainly, in most places, there's that sort of space for the students to use. I think the question of the interaction between the students becomes the issue at that point, whether it's still possible to do teamwork, exercises in that kind of face-to-face environment. And I, along with Keith and others, of course, would like to know those kinds of proximity restrictions, but that would mask, no mask, etc., that would pertain there. But certainly thinking of the library as that kind of space that's available for those purposes. Also, student centers, sometimes called student unions, are another example of that kind of space that's available on campus. And I think it's worth noting that both the library and the student centers and other spaces on campuses provide Wi-Fi service and hardware that may not be available for some students who would be compromised by either the service that they have at home or the kind of technology that's available to them. So I think the library in particular plays an important role in trying to level the playing field, as it were, for those students who are otherwise disadvantaged by virtue of technology.
That's great. Thank you so much. I do have a different one, John. I'd like you to grab this, and it's about how we handle the problem if we have out-of-state students, and if that state governor has in effect an isolation policy for 14 days if the person is entering the state. I mean, we're doing lots of things across state lines, not just federally. Do you have a sense of how that is playing out, or that you're hearing that, John? Or maybe Keith? John, you first.
I have not heard that. I maybe a couple of weeks ago I heard that some states, maybe bordering New York, or maybe it was Rhode Island, were imposing sort of mandatory quarantines on visitors from out of state. I don't know if that's even legal, or if you can legally do that. It would strike me, I'm no attorney, but it would strike me that might be problematic from a legal standpoint. But I had not thought about that at all from our standpoint. We're not in that situation here in Oregon. Although we do have, 500 freshmen from the state of California, and coming from areas where there are higher concentrations of sickness and death. We're sort of in a unique situation here. In our county, there have only been 5 deaths from coronavirus, and as few as 85 or 90 cases. And so for out here, life is very different than it is probably in Boston or New York or Chicago or LA. And so our concern is exactly that: students coming from places that are hotspots and bringing it to campus and turning Corvallis, Oregon into a hotspot. But I have to be honest and say I hadn't thought about how you would do that, how you would quarantine out-of-state students coming in. Good question.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. Keith, do you have any?
So Rhode Island did do that in the very beginning, John. They were exactly the state. So that neighbors, Connecticut, they were stopping they were trying to stop anybody from New York from coming in, but I'm not sure how successful that was. I will say, as part of quarantine, two things. One, we thought about, before we invited our students back to pick up their stuff over the next couple of days, we had to look at the travel bans that were in existence around our state to make sure that people could come back and actually get their things. So from the short term, and then from the longer term, what are the restrictions from Department of Public Health in those neighboring states that are close to us? Because our population is probably 30% Connecticut and then 70% someplace else outside of our state. So we did take a look at some of that data in some of where other Department of Public Health stood and government stood on allowing people to actually leave. As it relates to quarantine, we are, as part of I mentioned earlier, as part of the reopening of Connecticut, there needs to be a plan for students who test positive when we're here. As part of the enrollment issues that everybody is facing, and John highlighted so nicely, if we do have extra space, we are trying to determine which spaces could be used for quarantine that have their own separate bathrooms, that have perhaps a kitchen facility for those individuals to prepare food if they needed to. We've identified about 30 spaces so far, and a lot of it is contingent upon we've extended our deadline to June 1st for enrollment to make a deposit. So we'll see where we stand on June 1st.
That's a great add and really helpful for people on the call, both of you. Michael, I'm going to move to you on a different question, and that's, if distance learning continues, will colleges move to creating additional instruction technology spaces? And they said including booths, which I did not understand that, but that's okay. And will there be moves to digitize all lessons? hence bringing faculty into the 21st century. So that's a mouthful, but it is an interesting one in terms of the blend. You've talked a little bit about that. Can you speak to it?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. The booth piece, just to deal with that, has to do with, I believe, the importance of producing high quality audio with at least acceptable video in coursework. We find that the audio component is much more important than the video component. The video adds, of course, diagrams, demonstrations, etc. But poor quality audio is not. Folks won't hang in for that. And so some production spaces are required for those kinds of things. And the edge on this was really cut by the development of the MOOC, so-called MOOC programs, massive online and open courseware that's been developed by several folks and has many partners with academic institutions across the country. And so that would be a prototype in some cases. And I think it is, we can see that there has been historically a change in the amount of online courseware and courses that are done, to the point that I have had the experience many times to ask a faculty member how she teaches her particular course online compared to the way that she used to do it. And the response I invariably get is, well, I've never done it any other way. Now, the best of those teachers that I've come across are doing both and. In other words, they are able to use the technology of online instruction as well as engage their students when they are in the classroom. And so I think to that point, the campus does play that role. Keith has talked about being able to bring those students back to campus for those particular roles. And I think that future of education, the 21st century education, lies in thinking about the instructional activity as both and.
Great, that's excellent. I knew you would feel that. So, let me go to, we're talking about leveraging campus's digital environment. And Michael, you mentioned this to allow sharing of ideas. If they cannot be in the same physical space at the same time, can that be done? So Michael, and then I'm going to go to Keith because I think Thought Leaders did some work on that.
Oh, I'm going to toss it to Keith on that one. I mean, just using a simple example. Once upon a time, we exchanged letters. It took days, sometimes weeks, to get a response from somebody. And now we're used to an instantaneous response via online, which is only analogous to what we can get face-to-face. The bandwidth of face-to-face communication continues to be better, more complete, and it allows for those moments of surprise, those moments of true creativity. And I think I would join everybody on this call in hoping that we do not lose that ever.
Good.
I guess I would say from the thought leaders perspective, one of the things we did this year, which is unique to the 13 or 14 years we've been doing it, is this was not facilities and higher education folks in the room only. It was people from public school systems across the country, leaders of superintendents, principals. Actually, John was there. We had enrollment managers. What is the student of 2024? What does that person, what's their makeup? You know, what are they used to? How do they like to learn? How do they like to ingest information? And so you'll see a lot of that in the report in terms of they are more diverse than we've ever seen them before. They are technically far more advanced, in some cases more advanced than perhaps some of the folks that they engage with on a campus. But they do have other hurdles that they need to get through. There's a larger concern about mental health for some of those students. They are very much open to sharing information, which perhaps other students before them were not. But they are also focused on their return on investment and what that means. And so to the point of the question of their learning environment, in terms of could they do it some online or could they do some on ground, they need to see a return on their investment. Universities are not getting any cheaper anytime soon. And so therefore, they have an expectation, perhaps more than any other generation, that when they come out, a job will be there for them. I'm not sure with 36 million people unemployed, what that looks like for the class of 2020 that's graduating literally as we speak. But the 2024 student, which is our topic for thought leaders, does address those issues in terms of, what does this new generation look for in their learning outcomes.
That's really excellent, and I'm glad the two of you really provided an expanded response, because you cut across a number of questions that people were asking. Keith, I actually have an answer to a question that you asked from someone on the chat that said that face masks and social distancing come hand in hand. They're not, the face mask does not replace the need for social distancing, and that's per the infectious disease experts at Michigan State. So I think we're into face masks and social distancing, and that may have been the question you were asking, but I can always get you in touch with the right person, because I think we do have an answer to that. Okay? Is that helpful to you?
Yes, somebody stepped into my office in the middle of that conversation, so I apologize. That might have been a little bit discombobulated when it came out, so I apologize for that.
No, that's fine. So we are recognizing we're going to need, I'm going to go back to what Michael said, both and. And so we are getting desperately close to running out of time here. And I'm going to suggest that I'm going to give a couple of answers here. Someone asked about, if space is radically impacted by code requirements, the APA Standards and Codes Council will be tracking all of this, so we'll see what comes of that. Keith touched on dining halls, and with respect to how we're reconfiguring, thinking about physical, social distancing, et cetera. And the ACUI, which is the Association of College and University Housing Officers International website, is doing a lot of work around the dining hall side of this, so I commend them. Another is, you asked about face-to-face protocols for sanitizing every classroom, between classes, et cetera. Keith touched on that. However, we are going to have a full town hall next Friday on classroom cleaning protocols, et cetera, and HVAC, so we'll be looking at that particular one. And then finally, there was quite a question about the draconian measures that people are taking that may indeed justify destroying the higher education system and experience. And that point is well taken in terms of where we are today. It's not just the students that are on campus, but it's also the faculty. And so it's that blend. So it's going to be the debate of the century. There is no playbook, so we really don't have an answer, but I did want to state out loud that I heard that loud and clear, and we certainly recognize that that's not good. So as I go to close, let's be on the watch for a new survey to upload your reopening documents, plans, procedures, protocols that we will use to share with your colleagues. We're looking for a call for images, as usual, on your COVID-19 response for our website. There's a slide on resources that are available, and a save the date and next week's topic, which I mentioned earlier, which is in the trenches, cleaning protocols, HVAC requirements, and other facilities necessities. And finally, in a Harvard Business Review article this past week titled, How History's Great Leaders Managed Anxiety, with this deadly pandemic ravaging people's lives, history can serve as a guide in this regard. Further referencing James E. Robison's book, Forged in Crisis, it explains that history's very best leaders like Lincoln, Roosevelt, Mandela, and Churchill all understood how to provide stability, a steady hand, and hope, even when they themselves were uncertain about the road ahead. They were honest with their followers and found private outlets for their own anxieties. And they celebrated small victories, even when the losses seemed large, with a combination of brutal honesty and credible hope. I believe in each and every one of your abilities. And I believe even more so in our joint capabilities. We can and we will get through this together. Thank you. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Bye-bye.